In a recent press briefing, a bold claim was made by Karoline Leavitt that sparked immediate and widespread controversy. She referred to tariffs as a tax cut for the American people. This statement, delivered with confidence, was quickly met with criticism and disbelief from many corners of the political and economic spheres. The issue stems from the fundamental misunderstanding or misrepresentation of what tariffs actually are and how they operate in practice. While intended to sound like a populist economic strategy, framing tariffs as a benefit to the average citizen contradicts the established consensus among economists. Tariffs, by definition, are taxes imposed on imported goods. When a tariff is placed on foreign products, the immediate effect is an increase in the cost of those goods as they enter the domestic market. Although the tax is levied at the border, it is typically passed along the supply chain until it lands squarely on the consumer. This means that rather than serving as a tax cut, tariffs can function as an indirect tax hike, especially for working and middle-class families who rely on affordable goods for everyday needs. The industries that bear the brunt of these price increases often include essentials like food, clothing, electronics, and household items. The assertion that tariffs somehow operate as a tax relief mechanism runs counter to years of economic data and analysis. Numerous studies have shown that tariffs tend to result in increased prices for consumers and retaliatory measures from trade partners. These retaliatory tariffs can, in turn, hurt domestic exporters, particularly farmers and manufacturers who rely on foreign markets. The broader ripple effect can lead to job losses in affected industries and a decrease in overall economic productivity. Despite these well-documented outcomes, the framing of tariffs as a boon to the average citizen is still employed as a rhetorical tool to garner support for protectionist trade policies. This talking point, while catchy, also oversimplifies the complex nature of international trade and its interconnected consequences. By calling tariffs a tax cut, the implication is that they create financial relief or savings for consumers, when in reality, they often do the opposite. The burden of higher prices typically falls hardest on those with the least disposable income, turning what is framed as a benefit into a hidden cost. Retailers facing increased costs on imported inventory adjust by raising prices to maintain margins. These price hikes are not absorbed at the corporate level. They filter down to families shopping for school supplies, groceries, appliances, and other necessities. Adding to the confusion is the selective use of economic language to support this narrative. In fiscal policy, a tax cut typically refers to a reduction in income tax rates or other direct forms of taxation that increase a household's take-home pay or reduce their financial obligations to the government. Tariffs, conversely, are revenue-raising, tools that extract more money from the economy in the form of higher product prices. Labeling this mechanism as a tax cut not only stretches the definition but also risks misleading the public about the true nature and impact of the policy. The tension came to a head during the briefing when a reporter pressed for clarification, noting that tariffs are, by design, taxes paid by importers. When confronted with this basic economic fact, the spokesperson doubled down, dismissing the challenge as a test of her knowledge and attempting to reframe the exchange as unfair or adversarial. This deflection only intensified scrutiny, with many observers noting that the refusal to acknowledge the true economic impact of tariffs signals either a lack of understanding or an intentional attempt to spin policy for political advantage. Beyond the specifics of trade theory, the moment also underscores a broader dynamic in public discourse, where complex issues are often reduced to sound bites. The notion of tariffs as tax cuts is an appealing narrative. It's simple, defiant, and easy to repeat. But it masks the real-life consequences felt by consumers and businesses alike. Economists, trade analysts, and financial institutions have consistently warned against viewing tariffs through such a simplified lens, especially when those policies have historically led to trade wars, inflationary pressure, and reduced consumer choice. What was intended as a confident declaration of economic strategy ultimately revealed a gap between political messaging and economic reality. In a time when cost of living concerns dominate public attention, such messaging resonates strongly, particularly when delivered with certainty. Yet without grounding in factual accuracy or acknowledgement of historical outcomes, These claims risk eroding trust in official communication and policymaking. During a tense press briefing, an exchange unfolded that highlighted the strained relationship between the media and the administration's communications team. When a seasoned reporter from the Associated Press challenged the economic framing used by the press secretary, the atmosphere quickly shifted from routine questioning to open confrontation. The point of contention revolved around the claim that tariffs constitute a tax cut for the American people, a statement that raised immediate red flags among journalists present. The reporter, pushing for clarification, questioned the economic logic behind such a framing, noting that tariffs are typically paid by importers and often lead to higher consumer prices. Rather than responding with data or elaboration, the press secretary took a defensive posture. Instead of engaging the substance of the question, she pivoted to a more combative stance, accusing the journalist of trying to test her economic knowledge and suggesting that his question was inappropriate. This rhetorical maneuver, shifting the focus from policy to personal grievance, had a noticeable effect on the tone of the room. What could have been a substantive policy debate turned into a pointed exchange about respect, professionalism, and media bias. This moment was telling, for several reasons. First, it exposed the limits of messaging when confronted with factual challenges. The press secretary had arrived at the podium with a clear narrative that trade policies being implemented were a net positive for ordinary Americans. However, when asked to reconcile that narrative with economic fundamentals, the response lacked depth. Rather than providing a robust defense of the policy, she implied that the question itself was an act of bad faith, an attempt to corner her, rather than an earnest inquiry. This strategy of evading policy scrutiny by reframing it as a personal attack has become a recurring theme in these briefings. Second, the exchange underscored how the role of the press is being redefined in real time. Reporters are traditionally tasked with pressing for clarity, especially when public statements appear inconsistent with established facts. By treating such questions as disrespectful or adversarial, the administration creates an environment in which accountability is perceived as hostility. This dynamic has a chilling effect on the free exchange of ideas and can make it more difficult for the public to understand the true implications of government actions. When questions about tariffs, taxation, or inflation are dismissed as traps, rather than answered with clarity, the broader conversation about economic policy becomes muddied. There was also a noticeable shift in the power dynamics of the room. Historically, White House press secretaries have used these briefings to inform the public through direct engagement with journalists. Yet, in this instance, the platform was used more as a stage for posturing than for dialogue. The press secretary's comment that she regretted calling on the reporter was a clear signal. Questions that challenge the narrative are not welcome. That statement, while brief, carried significant weight. It implied that not all inquiries would be treated equally, and that access to the press secretary's attention might depend on the perceived tone or ideological bent of the questioner. This approach is risky. Journalists are not merely adversaries, they are intermediaries between the government and the public. If their questions are shut down for being inconvenient, the press briefing devolves into a performance rather than a tool of transparency. And when policy is articulated in such a way that it cannot withstand scrutiny, it raises doubts not only about the policy itself, but also about the confidence of those promoting it. This breeds an atmosphere of distrust, one in which facts are filtered through personal narratives and dissent is treated as disrespect. What made this exchange particularly striking was the immediacy of the reaction from the press corps. There was a visible sense of frustration, not just from the reporter involved, but from others who recognized that a legitimate question was being dodged. The tension in the room was not simply about one policy detail, it reflected a broader unease about how communication is being handled and how far the administration is willing to go to avoid engaging with dissenting perspectives. When those in power reject basic economic principles in favor of sound bites and then bristle at being questioned, it sends a clear signal about the role they envision for the media, and it's not one of cooperation. The press secretary's response did not just sidestep a difficult question. It transformed a technical debate into a personal standoff. That transformation may have been intentional, as it reframed the press as hostile actors and deflected attention from the economic claims being challenged. However, in doing so, it also raised new concerns about transparency, accountability, and the integrity of public discourse. A recent press briefing took an unexpected turn when the press secretary made a pointed remark about a federal judge, referring to him as a Democratic activist judge appointed by Barack Obama. The statement was delivered with force and certainty, clearly intended to cast doubt on the impartiality of the judge in question. However, almost immediately, a reporter interjected with a correction, noting that the judge was originally appointed by President George W. Bush before later being elevated by President Obama. The correction, made on the spot and with visible professionalism, challenged the narrative that had just been presented to the public. The press secretary chose not to acknowledge the factual inaccuracy. Instead of adjusting her remarks or clarifying the context, she pivoted quickly, pressing forward with claims that the judge was part of a larger institutional bias working against her team. This move signaled a clear reluctance to engage with inconvenient facts, and it also illuminated a broader pattern of undermining the judiciary when rulings do not align with the preferred outcome. The initial misstatement may have seemed like a small slip to some, but in the context of political rhetoric, it carried heavy implications. Federal judges, by design, are meant to operate outside of partisan pressures. Their appointments, while made by presidents, are confirmed by the Senate and are expected to result in judicial independence. By labeling a judge with a partisan identity and attributing his rulings to political motives, the administration put into question the legitimacy of the court's neutrality. This is a delicate and dangerous line to walk, especially in a country where public trust in institutions is already fragile. Such rhetoric does more than just challenge one ruling. It erodes faith in the fairness of the entire judicial process. What stood out even more was the refusal to engage with the correction. When a press secretary is publicly corrected on a factual detail, particularly one that is central to an argument being made, the expectation is that there will be either a concession or an explanation. Neither came. Instead, the press secretary continued to criticize the judge, implying that any association with a political party, even one inaccurately stated, was enough to call the integrity of his decisions into question. This tactic effectively shifted attention away from the content of the ruling and redirected it toward a broader, emotionally charged narrative of institutional bias. This type of framing is not new, but its repetition in official briefings contributes to a broader campaign of delegitimizing outcomes that are politically inconvenient. When a court ruling goes against the administration's interests, the response is not to address the substance of the decision, but to attack the motivations of the person behind it. This strategy undermines the concept of checks and balances that the judicial branch is meant to uphold. When citizens hear that judges are being labeled as partisan actors every time a decision is handed down, it becomes harder to distinguish between lawful adjudication and political vendetta. The moment also underscored the critical role of journalists in these briefings. The reporter who fact-checked the claim did so respectfully and with evidence, which reinforced the press's duty to hold officials accountable in real time. It also demonstrated the importance of institutional memory and public record, reminding everyone that facts still matter, even when narratives attempt to override them. The fact-check served as an essential corrective force in a setting that is often more focused on controlling the message than conveying truth. What could have been a teachable moment, an opportunity to clarify, correct, and even shift into a more nuanced discussion about judicial philosophy, was passed up in favor of doubling down. This choice reflects a larger communication strategy that prioritizes loyalty over accuracy and perception over principle. It's easier, after all, to dismiss a judge as biased than to explain a ruling on its merits. But doing so not only damages the credibility of the office, but also sets a precedent that any institution challenging authority can be dismissed as corrupt or partisan. The broader implication of this incident is the normalization of attacking judges when rulings are unfavorable. When these attacks are based on inaccurate information and go uncorrected even after being publicly challenged, they contribute to a climate where truth becomes optional and accountability becomes elusive. This pattern doesn't just affect political opponents or isolated cases. It shifts public expectations of governance and distorts the foundational principle that justice should be blind. By sidestepping the facts and reinforcing a narrative of judicial hostility, the press secretary sent a message that loyalty to the cause outweighs allegiance to truth. At just 27 years old, the current White House press secretary has quickly become one of the most polarizing figures in the national spotlight. Her rapid ascent to such a high-profile role is remarkable, not just because of her age, but also because of the striking contrast she brings to the podium. She has cultivated a public persona that is sharp, unyielding, and unapologetically combative, presenting herself as a staunch defender of the administration's policies and a fierce adversary of what she characterizes as media bias. This style has garnered both admiration and criticism, turning her into a symbol of the administration's broader communication strategy. Supporters hail her as a trailblazer, someone who has broken barriers and stands strong in the face of hostile press rooms. They see her as a breath of fresh air, someone who doesn't bend to pressure, who pushes back against what they perceive to be unfair treatment by the media, and who echoes their frustrations with the establishment. Her composure and confidence, especially when responding to challenging or even aggressive lines of questioning, have been praised by many in her political base. They argue that she's doing what few before her have dared to do: stand toe-to-toe with seasoned journalists and refuse to back down. But critics view the same qualities through a very different lens. To them, her tone often crosses into condescension. Rather than fostering transparency, they argue she undermines it by dismissing legitimate questions and using rhetorical sleight of hand to avoid giving clear answers. They note her tendency to pivot away from inconvenient facts and respond with accusations of media bias or political persecution, rather than directly addressing concerns. In their view, she uses her platform not to inform the public, but to promote a narrative that blurs the line between communication and propaganda. This duality in perception has turned her into a lightning rod for public debate. On the one hand, she is celebrated for her effectiveness and loyalty. On the other, she is criticized for what some see as the normalization of misleading statements and the erosion of respectful discourse. Her approach is not one of careful diplomacy. Rather, it is built around sharp messaging and the relentless repetition of talking points, even when they are challenged by facts presented in real time. Her defenders say this is strategy. Her detractors call it spin. Her confrontational style has also resulted in several viral moments. Videos of her clashing with journalists circulate widely on social media, often framed in ways that reinforce the political leanings of the viewer. In right-leaning spaces, she is seen dismantling gotcha questions and standing strong against a biased press. In left-leaning circles, she is portrayed as evading accountability and responding to factual challenges with deflection and attitude. These clips are edited, shared, and dissected endlessly, turning her briefings into performance pieces as much as informational sessions. The spectacle, in many ways, has become the story. What makes her rise especially noteworthy is the context in which it's happening. In a media environment saturated with disinformation, distrust, and partisan division, public figures in communications roles are no longer expected to merely convey policy. They are expected to fight for it. She fits that mold perfectly. Her presence at the podium is not about bridging differences or reaching across ideological lines. Instead, it's about energizing the base, reinforcing loyalty, and projecting strength. To many, she is not just a spokesperson. She is a symbol of a new era of political messaging, one where precision matters less than passion, and where confrontation is not a risk, but a strategy. The intensity of the reactions she provokes is also linked to her identity and age. As one of the youngest individuals ever to hold the role, she challenges traditional expectations of authority and expertise. For some, her youth and confidence are inspiring. For others, they are seen as insufficient substitutes for experience and depth. This generational dynamic adds another layer to the public discourse around her, as debates about credibility, tone, and professionalism are filtered through the lens of age, gender, and political allegiance. Her tenure so far reflects a larger shift in how public officials interact with the press and the public. Briefings are no longer just about policy, they are about narrative control. Every question is an opportunity to reinforce a theme. Every answer, whether complete or evasive, is crafted with an eye toward how it will play on television and social media. In this environment, the role of press secretary has evolved from that of a behind-the-scenes communicator to a frontline combatant in the ongoing war over public perception. And no figure better embodies that transformation than the one currently occupying the podium. The recent press briefing that sparked this wave of attention was more than just a tense exchange between a press secretary and the media. It was a microcosm of the broader political climate. Every element, from the economic spin to the attack on the judiciary, and from the media confrontation to the performance-driven messaging, points to a shift in how information is delivered, controlled, and contested in the public arena. The briefing was not simply about tariffs or judicial rulings. It became a reflection of how governance and communication have merged into a high-stakes battleground for narrative dominance. What stood out most was not a single sentence or policy stance, but the full display of a communication style that no longer attempts to persuade across the aisle or seek common ground. The goal now is to project strength, consolidate support, and control perception, even if that means overriding facts or reframing challenges as partisan attacks. The moment the press secretary brushed aside a legitimate economic correction, dismissed a journalist's question as hostile, and mischaracterized a federal judge's record without acknowledging the error, it became clear that these briefings are no longer built around open dialogue. They are carefully orchestrated performances designed to feed a pre-existing worldview, and yet, even within this controlled environment, tension cracks through. Reporters pushing back in real time, facts challenging spin, a slip of words that sparks viral debate. These moments reveal that, despite the increasingly curated nature of political messaging, the truth still finds ways to fight for space. Journalists who step in to correct the record, sometimes under pressure, sometimes in hostile environments, continue to play a vital role. Their resistance to accepting oversimplified narratives reminds the public that these exchanges are not mere theater. They're part of the democratic process. The public, too, plays a role in interpreting these moments. For some, the press secretary's refusal to concede or clarify is seen as strength. For others, it's a red flag for the health of public discourse. In either case, the effect is the same: more polarization, more division, and more attention paid not to what was said, but how it was said. The performance of power has taken center stage. In the end, the viral sentence that changed everything didn't do so because it offered a new idea or clarified a policy. It changed everything because it perfectly captured the spirit of our current political moment, one defined by confrontation, spectacle, and a relentless effort to control the narrative. The briefing will be remembered not for the data it presented, but for the emotions it stirred and the lines it drew. In now, a time when politics is as much about perception as policy, that may be the most powerful currency of all.